a church youth pastor in the US. Benny, what I'd love you to do is just tell us a bit of your story of how you set up First Priority and why. So off you go.
Well, thank you, Colin, for the opportunity to let me share with everyone. I really appreciate the work you're doing, and even the opportunity for people to tell their stories. And because I think all of our stories are a part of his story. And as you mentioned in the introduction, I served as a local church youth pastor for 27 years. As a young man, I felt a call of God on my life, like so many, but not really certain of what that meant. So I think I went through the same struggle that everybody does in trying to determine, God, what is it specifically that you want me to do? But on my journey of trying to seek God and serve Him, it became very clear that working with young people was the passion of my heart, and the gifts that God had given me really fit the profile or the job of a youth pastor. And so I began to serve in churches, and I served in 5 different churches over those 27 years in 5 different cities. And what we discovered in our culture, and what I've found out is in talking with others even outside the U.S. on a very similar journey, is we began to see the church become less and less an impact on the community as a ever-invading secular humanist philosophy was being encouraged and taught. And so we saw the church become less the center of people's lives, and at the same time we saw a very destructive culture emerge in our society, a culture that was stealing our kids and robbing our kids of their spirituality and deceiving them, and then ultimately offering them decisions that became very destructive and even deadly. And so I'm sure everybody identifies with that who's been working with young people. But I began to pray and cry out to God as a youth pastor with a real desire to make a difference, and saying, God, what is it that you want me to do? What can we do to reclaim a generation of young people for you? I felt God tell me 2 things very specifically, and this was over a 2-year period of seeking Him and really just pouring my heart out before Him. And He said, I want you to do 2 things. I began to write it down, and 2 things emerged as the central themes. One of them was to unite the churches in my city. And I began to realize that even with my own best efforts to be a youth pastor and try to reach the kids I could that were in my church and in the community around me and in my city, even at my best, I was reaching such a small minority of the kids. And even when I began to look at what other youth leaders and churches in our city were doing, we still felt like we were missing the majority of the students in our city. And I had this real burden and passion, and so I felt like the Lord was saying, unite the churches. And, you know, we believe that we're all one church, many different expressions of that church, but ultimately we are the church, the one church, the followers of Christ. And so He said, bring them together with a city focus. And then the second thing He said is put a plan together that can share the love of Christ and the truth, the message of Christ, with every young person in your city. And I began to look at my plan as what I was trying to do as a youth pastor. And very clearly it became apparent to me that if everything in my plan worked, I still would not be able to reach but 1% or just a small minority of the young people in our city. And so, again, these 2 things, unite the churches in your city, and then put a plan together to reach every student, every young person in your city with the message of Christ. And so I began to share this with other people. I would share with them my passion and this pursuit of God and what I began to hear Him say. And I was overwhelmed by their complacency and indifference. The very things I felt like God was telling me to do was, number 1, unite the churches, and immediately I was told by even leaders in the church, you'll never be able to unite the church in a city. The church is too fractured, it's too divided. It's divided over theological issues, it's divided over traditions and practices. And so I was very discouraged at the beginning when I felt like this is what they were telling me to do, what God was telling me to do. Then I began to think of just sharing a strategy. God, what would this plan look like? Give me a vision for what it would look like to see the church come together with a plan to take the message of Christ to every student. And we all know, as Solomon wrote 3,000 years ago, there's nothing new under the sun. So as we began to pursue God and really seek Him, the things He told us to do were really things that we were already instructed to do in the Scripture. We wanted to be creative and contemporary, but the foundational things of taking the time to share the gospel, to meet people, and to begin to extend to them the love of Christ and model the love of Christ, and then look for open doors to simply share the message of truth of God's love. We looked for creative ways to do that, but it really became a very simple plan to systematically identify the groups of students in our city, in our schools, in our communities, in whatever areas we could, and then begin to put a plan in place to take the message of Christ to them in a very loving, non-threatening, non-condemning way, the way I felt like Christ would do it Himself. So we began to do this. Really, it took 2 years to get a group of youth pastors to align themselves, not just as a network, to begin to meet together and learn through relationship building and trust to work together, but begin to pray through and align ourselves strategically in what are the things that we could truly cooperate doing. One of the things we discussed was we should never do anything together that we could do individually. In other words, it was not a thing of replacing their local church youth ministry that had great value for their church and their community, but it was what are the things we could do cooperatively that would have more impact in the community and reaching the generation of kids in our community that we could ever do individually. And so we learned through a process of a couple of years how to begin to work together, trust one another, and then strategically pray and strategize together of how we could take the message of Christ to every young person in our city. The first city I worked in was Irving, Texas, and in Irving we knew one of the major focuses would be in the schools. So we began to talk about how we could link our church youth groups, identify leaders in each of the schools that our church was affiliated with, and begin to put together a student-led strategy, a student movement built on prayer and equipping students in their everyday lives in school to be a witness for Christ, a missionary in their school, to begin to share the message of Christ. We saw tremendous results take place. As I shared with the students, the number one reason a young person comes to Christ is when a friend tells them the story. And so we began to try to equip our students, encourage them to simply tell his story in a relationship pattern with their friends as relationships developed and trust developed, to simply share their faith. And we saw many, many young people come to Christ through a simple presentation of the gospel by a friend. And then we began to do activities and events, something churches do, networking. They usually do events and they'll come together. So we did many events where we networked our resources and brought our students together and used that group and the influence that a group of young people brought to their peers to create different venues and crowds and ways to share the gospel. I think there's two ways to fish. You fish with a pole and you fish with a net. And we would call fishing with a pole, personal evangelism, and fishing with a net, event evangelism. And so we incorporated both, teaching young people how to personally share their faith and then to be involved in outreach events and creative ways to bring students into a place where they could, in a very non-condemning, non-threatening way, hear the message of the love of Christ. And so God began to knit our hearts together as youth pastors and then teach us strategies and ways to begin to share the message of Christ with every young person in our city.
Benny, that's an amazing story. We're going to hear more from Benny over the coming weeks, but thank you for that incredible introduction. Thank you.